folks. Happy Tuesday evening. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Just a quick housekeeping note. If you need the restroom, restrooms are back the way you came through those purple curtains and to the right. And emergency exits are also back the way you came, as well as on the other side of the tech booth. Fabulous. Now please give it up for Dan Fagan.
And hello also to those of you who are joining us online. This is something new for us after, I don't know, probably at least 12, 13, 14 years of doing these events. This is the first one we're doing at Caveat, which is an amazing live space here in New York. Unfortunately, because of NYU's COVID restrictions, it's just our students who are in the audience, but we hope lots of you, including Sherpa alums and lots of science communication people, are also joining us online. If you have questions, please, you can either use the chat box, you can either use the chat in YouTube, on the YouTube live stream, or you can tweet using the Kavli Convo hashtag Kavli Convo, one word. At this point, I would like to introduce the moderator and impresario for tonight's event, and that is the wonderful Jess Boddy. Come on out, Jess. Are you there, Jess? Come on out. There she is. Jess is an editor at Popular Science. She was also a graduate of the SHIRT program at NYU, which I direct. And she's just an all-around awesome person who has a real eye for the weird, which makes her a really good choice to run this event. So with that, one other housekeeping thing. For those of you in the audience, if you have questions, just come on up to the mic and Jess will see you, and at some point in the conversation, she'll motion to you and you can ask your question. So Jess, take it away.
Hello, I'm Jess. Like Dan said, I work at PopSci. I am what's known as Associate Editor of Special Projects, which means I do a lot of things, but mostly I produce our podcasts, one of which is newer. It's called Ask Us Anything. It's short form. It's an explainer show. And then the other one is called The Weirdest Thing I Learned This Week, which is going on its 5th season, which is really fun. Obviously deals with weird topics. But yeah, I'd love to introduce our guests. And I have my notes on my phone because I could not, who has a printer? Not me. So first, I want to introduce Marc Abrahams, who has written columns for The Guardian, Harvard Business Review. They've created CBS Radio's first science podcast, but you probably know him because he is the creator of the Ig Nobel Prizes. Please welcome Marc Abrahams. And then, Cara, you can, join us. This is Cara Giaimo, a freelancer who covers animals, plants, all type of fun, weird stuff. You probably have seen their work in Atlas Obscura or The Times, and you're also working on a book, right? Or books, plural?
Yeah, I'm working on 2 books right now. One of them is for middle schoolers, and one of them is for Atlas Obscura.
Cool beans. Well, yeah, guys, welcome. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about like what you do and like how your work is weird? Like, Marc, do you want to go first with that?
I'll defer.
Oh, what?
Well,
Yeah.
my work is actually perfectly normal, so not really qualified. Yeah, I read a lot about sort of strange new things that we've discovered that animals do, or plants do, or fungi do. I really like it. I find it very rewarding. And people also seem to like it. Like, I think stories of that type are really popular right now, maybe because they're just like a little bit different from everything else going on in the science world and also the larger world.
Yeah, and I'd like to say I've known Cara a little bit for a number of years now, since she was a student. And the last couple of years, it's been thrilling is exactly the right word, to open up the New York Times, or whatever the verb is now, and see the stories that I start reading, because I can't not read these stories, and see who wrote them, Cara Giaimo. And it felt when I first met her that this is likely to happen, but you never know for sure. So it's, congratulations and thank you for writing all these things.
Oh yeah, thank you. I feel like you kind of paved the way for this whole area, so I really appreciate your work too.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, paving is what I do. I'd like to talk about weird a little bit, and this word and this idea. I think the three of us, have probably benefited by this word a little bit and suffered by this word a lot. And I expect that each of you has, to some degree, occasionally at least. Weird is itself a weird word, because whether something strikes you as weird is entirely a matter of whether it's something that you're familiar with or not. If somebody looks at something you've done or hears about something you've done, and they normally never have come in contact with it or heard about it, it could be the dullest thing in the world to you and to everybody except them, but to them, it's weird. And now combine that with science, which has a similar kind of provocation in the world to an awful lot of people. Everybody in this room, I'm pretty sure, likes science quite a bit, and you probably have most of your life. It's interesting and many other good things. But we've all seen that a lot of the people we grew up with didn't feel that way, and some of them probably have real good reasons for doing that. But the fact is, they feel that way. And if you have spent any time at all asking anybody that gives you that pop-eyed expression when they hear you have something to do with science, and my goodness, you write about it, why would you want to do that? If you've ever tried to get them to talk a little bit about what they think science is and what they think scientists do and what they think people who write about science do, I think that's a lot weirder than anything you're going to hear any of us talk about. I mean, the stuff, I try to do this a lot because I'm really curious, especially once in a while, somebody's first reaction if they hear I do these odd prizes is sort of attacking either me or the people who get the prizes.
Yeah, I wanted you to explain
Yeah.
the Ig Nobels first, just a little bit, or if
Yeah.
you have any, first, what are they? And then second,
Yeah.
if there's any that stick out in your mind, because I definitely have a couple that, I will
Okay.
never forget.
Why don't we start with those?
Oh, I love the dung beetles that navigate by the stars.
Yeah.
I will never forget that one. But yeah, do you want to explain, how you got started with all that? I mean, they've
Sure.
been going for quite some time, right?
Sure, yeah. I'll start by saying everything I'm doing pretty much professionally now I was doing when I was a little kid. Not for money and not in any very organized way, but I never thought that this was something adults do, so I never aimed to make a profession of this because I never saw anybody doing anything like this. And I was off doing very different stuff, mostly involved with computers. But I was still doing this kind of stuff, collecting things that I found funny and interesting. After many years of doing it, I finally came up with a phrase that seemed to make sense to other people more than anything else, which is, look, I collect stuff that makes people laugh and then think. That phrase, by the way, changed. When I finally came up with that phrase, that made life so much better for me and all of us doing this stuff. Until then, we had
The power of branding.
Yeah, it's the power of branding, and you really get to appreciate it when it's something you're doing, and it's the power of people no longer misunderstanding. Yeah. And when I said that phrase to a reporter who was talking on the phone, who was calling up about one of the prizes, which I will explain in a minute,
Yeah.
and I'm sorry to be dominating the conversation here.
You're good. Go for it.
There was a reporter who called up one year to talk about the Ig Nobel winners for that year. And I could tell he thought it was really funny, but he also thought these were insulting prizes and these people were stupid who'd done these things. And I was trying, as I usually do, to get him to understand you're missing the point and you're missing the good parts of this. And he told me especially that his favorite prize that year was about some people in Colorado, a married couple, who had invented and were selling a new kind of underwear that had a removable charcoal filter to trap bad-smelling gases. And he thought that was the funniest thing he had ever encountered
Real fart
in his
joke
life.
lover, huh?
And yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, you've all met people who enjoy their life by concentrating on that kind of stuff. And I finally because I couldn't think of anything else, I tried some new words and said, look, this is about stuff that makes people laugh and then think. And I could hear on the phone, I could feel on the other end of the phone, everything changed. His tone of voice changed, and he started telling me about his best friend who has a terrible gastroenterology disease that causes them to be farting all day long. And it sounds funny, he said, but it's horrible. It's a tragedy. And he went on and on and on. And then the whole conversation was different. And he wrote a beautiful article appreciative of the Ig Nobel Prizes. So I wrote that phrase down that had popped out of my mouth, makes people laugh, then think. And I diligently used that in every other conversation over the next few weeks and months. And I could see it was so much better. People now, they kind of understood. And the hostility that some people would have became almost a rare thing. So I said some people are hostile, but that at the beginning there was a fair amount of that, but there's not too much anymore. For one thing, we've been doing this for more than 30 years, and now I'll explain. So these are 10 prizes we give every year for things that make people laugh and then think. And that's the only requirement on these.
And it's research.
No, not necessarily. It could
Not
be
always.
absolutely, it could be anything. We often give a literature prize. We can prize in art. We give economics prize, peace prize. It can be absolutely anything. It has to be real. But if we choose well, each of these things has the quality that when almost anybody anywhere in the world first hears about it, which these days they'll read a couple sentences on the internet, but they might hear it on the radio or someplace else. But when the first instant they hear about it, their immediate reaction is to laugh. And almost always because it's really surprise. It's something that's so far outside their experience that their only almost physical reaction is to laugh. But there's also got to be something about it, if we chose well, that is going to stick in their mind. And a week later, again, if we've chosen well, a week later, they're still thinking about it. And all they really want to do is tell their friends about it and argue about it. So that's what this is about. And, I have hopes about sort of deeper things that come from that. But basically, it's that we will choose, 10 things somewhat at random simply because there are so many great things like that. And that these 10 things will get people around the world, lots and lots of people paying attention to them. And we now know, because we've been doing it so long and it keeps growing, that almost always each of these 10 winners, some of them are teams, will get tons of attention around the world from reporters. And most of the prizes go for things related to science. And from whatever big or little experience you've already had dealing with scientists, most scientists, like most other people in the world, no matter what they do, no matter how wonderful it is or even how horrifying it is, nobody is ever going to notice. Nobody's ever going to pay any attention, no matter what they do. So here we have these prizes, which are not important, these Ig Nobel prizes, but they get a lot of attention around the world. And suddenly, these people are getting phone calls and email and sometimes even visits from reporters. And the institutions started picking up on this really fast. This surprised us, that institutions within the first few years became very eager to get these Ig Nobel prizes.
Did they start campaigning for you guys?
Yes.
For their own
we started
scientists?
getting campaigns. We started getting bribe offers
No way.
from universities, companies,
Monetary?
government. Not usually monetary.
Sure.
Not usually.
In other forms?
But other forms, yeah.
Okay.
And so we just laugh at that.
Yeah.
And now the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen what happens quite often is if they're attached to a company or a university, often the company or university will make a little video. And often the last few years especially, it's the head of the university or the company in the video talking about how proud they are, which is kind of ridiculous and kind of wonderful at the same time. And it also gives, I think, some kind of gentle license, not only to those people, but everybody else in the whole university or the company that, look, you can do something that's actually interesting and you can talk about it and you might not be punished.
Yeah.
Because people are scared.
I'm interested because I know when I asked you guys both what you wanted to talk about, like Cara, you brought up how like this idea of weird, the way that we journalists can kind of pose it, or Ig Nobel judges can kind of pose this idea of weird, can kind of give attention to scientists who might not otherwise be heard about or, you know, publicized or that sort of thing. I mean, is that like something that plays into your work a lot? Is that something you think about when you're like looking for stories and stuff? Or, you know, can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. So a lot of the stuff I write about, I guess it could be seen as somewhat niche, like some of these animal studies where people are studying like a certain sort of insect and how fast it can regurgitate. Like maybe that has certain applications for life, human life, but it might not come out for, you know, years to decades. So right now these scientists are sort of like toiling over this question, and they don't necessarily expect anyone to call them up and ask them about it. That can be a really nice part of the job, because often when you're a scientist in that position, you're really only doing this thing because you love to do it. You're not really doing it because you expect to reap the rewards of any particular result like within your lifetime. And that can be a really good type of person to interview because they have a lot of very natural enthusiasm. And in some cases, they've been waiting to talk about this for many, many years. And you can really tap into that and get some really good quotes from them, and also get excited about it yourself and transfer that excitement onto the readers. So I do really like that. I was going to say, Mark, when you were talking about the married couple that made the charcoal underwear, married couples who do science together are amazing. And they're incredible to talk to. Earlier this year, I spoke to a married couple who have been working together for a very, very long time on antlions, and they live in the UK, and they spend their vacations going to remote islands in the UK, collecting antlion larvae and bringing them back to a hotel.
What
and
is
then
this? Can you describe this being?
Yes, okay. So an antlion, like an adult antlion, is like
Is
a
it
sort
an
of
ant or a lion?
It's a really good question. It's neither an ant or a lion. Just like a bee wolf is not a wolf or a bee. It's
not what I
weird.
expected.
Everybody has to start over. It doesn't make any sense. But an antlion, it's an insect. In its adult form, it's like winged and predatory. In its larval form, it's quite small and sort of defenseless. And so the defense that it has come up with is that it's really good at playing dead. And so if you sort of come upon one and surprise it, it will just go like for sometimes a very, very long time, like an hour, like perfectly still, and then sometimes a shorter amount of time. So they, described this very memorable week-long holiday where they every day went out, collected antlions, brought them back to their hotel. I guess probably in some sort of like hidden receptacle.
Yeah, I would not, as a hotel, like if I were a hotel owner,
Yeah.
don't want those in my hotel.
No, there's probably not like a no antlion policy, but only because they haven't had to deal with it before. So yeah, and timing how long they played dead for, and then they came out with this cool paper, and it was actually like illustrative of this really cool mathematical principle. But you know, they really liked talking about it, and it was really fun to talk about it with them. And so sometimes this stuff that seems kind of obscure, if you have someone who's dedicated their life to it, like you said, it's not obscure to them. It's actually like quite resonant and meaningful and beautiful to them, and you can kind of like really, they're excited to talk to you about those aspects of it.
Yeah, something you made me think of too, related to that, about what's weird, what's ordinary, and all that. Something that we've heard from a number of Ig Nobel winners over the year, and from fully half of them this year, is afterward they'll, you know, the winners are secret until we have the ceremony, so the winners don't know who the others are, and nor do the people who are going to physically hand them their prize know who the winners are until that moment usually. And so at the ceremony, the winners get to see who everybody is. And afterwards, this year, fully half of them said, one at a time, I looked at the list of winners, and I can see why you chose the others, but we in our team don't understand why you chose us. I mean, there's nothing funny about what we did. And the first one, it probably wasn't the first one happened, but in my mind, it's the first I remember. Because there was a lot of other colorful stuff that happened around them. It was a team from Australia, probably about 20 years ago, won the Ig Nobel Prize for Physics that year for a paper they had published called an analysis of the forces required to drag sheep across various surfaces. an analysis of the forces required to drag sheep across various surfaces. Okay, and they didn't see why anybody would find
Why
that
do you need
funny.
to drag sheep across various surfaces?
Oh, good. Then it worked, our choice of this.
I laughed, and then I thunk.
Yeah, it was a team of about 7 of them. They work in Victoria, Australia, which is in the southeastern corner of the main island of Australia. And it's a region where one of the big industries is sheep. And one year, a bunch of people in the industry wanting to make more money and cut down on problems. One of the big problems being that they drag thousands of sheep into big buildings, and they have giant electric shears, and there are a lot of injuries to the sheep and to the people. And these run into money as well as injuries. So you have an industry wanting to make more money. So they hired a bunch of scientists to come in, just spend a lot of time, look at everything we do, and tell us how we can do it better and more safely. That's what they did. And this was the paper. And I've been at a number of public events with one of the team since then, where somebody will ask, the audience questions are always the best part of public events with Ig Nobel winners, if you go. So somebody will inevitably ask, well, what was the most important thing you discovered? And this guy always, in my experience, starts at that moment to look sheepish, sorry to put it that way, and says, well, in a way, the most important thing we discovered was it's easier to drag a sheep downhill. And the story of that is, as the industry would grow, it would, any of these people in the industry would start out with one building where all the sheep are brought, and then they get bigger, so they add another building, and they put ramps between the buildings, and eventually they got a lot of buildings connected by ramps. And when they do it, of course, it just grows, and they don't redo the previous stuff that's already built. So every day, there are thousands of sheep being dragged uphill, and nobody doing it stopped to think about what was going on until these 7 scientists came in and told them.
It's wild. I mean, it just goes to show. I mean, I can see why it's not if you're looking at it that hard for that long, you might not think it's that weird or interesting. Yeah. But the title of the paper, like you said,
But not to them. The phone call where I offered them the prize, that was the first time anyone in that group realized it was funny. Another odd thing about that was several of them or maybe all of them, I've forgotten, are at the same university. And sometimes they will say, when it's in advance in secret, can we tell, head of the university or whoever, because they might want to know. We don't want them to be shocked. And so you usually will say, sure, just ask them to keep it secret until. Mm-hmm. The head of that university had a hissy fit and forbade them to accept this prize.
Why? Because it made their work seem silly or something?
Why is a very interesting question, because how do you know that the answer that you think you're getting is the real answer?
Right.
And how do you get it in this situation? But they decided that chances of them getting much attention from the world were not that high. So they decided as a group, we're going to accept this no matter what is being threatened. They did. They got lots of really favorable attention in the press, especially in Australia. And so it turned out being a really happy story for them.
That's great.
But at that point, 20 years ago, it was not that uncommon that the administrators had who knows what fears about somebody in our university, in our company, whatever, is going to do something that will cause somebody to laugh, and that's the worst thing in the world, even if what they're laughing at is the thing that we're most proud of.
Right. They don't understand the power.
Now you've nailed it. They don't understand, and they're not willing to step back and relax and try to understand.
Right. So we have a question, perhaps? Yeah, go for it. And as a reminder, you too can ask a question by tweeting at us using the hashtag #KavliConvo. Okay, what's your question?
Yeah.
And you can introduce yourself too.
Yeah, hey, I'm Abe. I'm a student in the SHARE program. So this question could also be for Jess, but in writing about entertaining, weird, goofy stuff, do you ever feel like you've pigeonholed yourself, or do you also feel that you can, editors will take it seriously, writing hard-hitting, quote, serious journalism? And then as a follow-up, are there circumstances where you might get to do both?
I feel like I have an answer for this. I think, like, as journalists, one of the most important parts of the job is actually finding stories that other people aren't telling often. And the quote-unquote weird stories can fall into that category because maybe nobody else is thinking about this. Or a quote-unquote weird way to approach a story can also fall into that problem. Like, category, like, even if you want to cover a news event, if you want, especially if you're like freelance or you're at a desk that's kind of crowded, you want to have an angle on it that nobody else has. And so kind of having this lens of like, okay, what's kind of weird about this? Like, what's not being covered? Who can I talk to who no one else is talking to? Can be really helpful for selling stories and also for being maybe the story that stands out when there are 20 different stories about the same thing on the same day. So in that way, it can be really beneficial. And in terms of like also being able to do other stuff, I do think that like the skills you develop from covering these stories are super transferable. So you learn, like, you have to interview people, you have to explain things well, you have to be entertaining and interesting. Like, you can do that about anything. So I don't personally feel very pigeonholed, but I also am someone who's like really excited about this beat, so I might not be the perfect person to ask about that.
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that too. Like, I think it depends on like what kind of journalist you are, or like what you like to write about, what like makes you feel alive, enthusiastic. Because like for me, and maybe this is my perspective as a staffer versus a freelancer, and I don't do much writing anymore, if any. But I always felt like it was a privilege to be able to write about the fun, weird stuff, especially in the world we live in today. I mean, even in a post-2016 world, which was when I graduated undergrad. We all know what happened in 2016. You know, a lot of science news in general became very serious. And so I feel like a lot of us who loved to write about the weird stuff were kind of forced to write about the serious stuff. So for a while, I felt like any chance I got to write about exploding ants, like, you know, give me that chance. And I still feel like that's still a privilege for a lot of us. But like Cara saying, like, if you can just find that novel angle, like, that is still so valuable, no matter how much, I mean, it depends on the outlet, but no matter how much like hard news somebody is publishing, like, you want that fun one too. Like, people still really want to click on those, I think.
Yeah, I've never seen really, in my view, in my opinion, whatever, much of a line between science and everything else. Although that's not the way it shakes out in any industry. And I've never seen any line where I thought things ought to be covered differently. And as far as weird goes, picking up on something I just heard you say, look back in the news over who was president for the period of 4 years. And
that's what I was referring to.
If you looked at the biggest headline news items just about any day during that period, and if there was something about, say, antlions in the news, probably a much smaller thing, which of those things would be the weird thing if you had to pick one of those two? Right? But if you have a discussion with most editors, higher editors in places, many of whom are a little frightened of science and anything to do with science, they will automatically tell you that it's the antlion thing that's the weird thing. It's not this guy with the makeup and the crap on his head running around spewing whatever, you know, words he just came up with randomly, and a field full of thousands of people cheering him wildly, and some senators standing up saying this is the best thing we must do. You know, which of those is the weird thing?
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about, there's two splinters off of this conversation that I had put in my like notes for ideas for this talk. The first has to do with enthusiasm and how important that is when writing about the weird stuff, the fun weird stuff. And I wanted to ask you guys, like, you know, your experience with that, with your own enthusiasm, with your sources' enthusiasm. And if you ever find a story that you think is really great, that you feel great about, but maybe your sources aren't. I mean, you've already spoke about that with the sheep people, but how, you know, like, how do you guys deal with that? And how do you inject your own enthusiasm, and how, like, why is that so important, I guess, is another question.
Yeah, well, enthusiasm certainly helps because in this particular line of journalism, I don't feel like there's a lot of call for like forcing people to talk about stuff when they don't want to. Like if you're a political journalist or like something else that kind of has like real world implications and you're talking to like powerful people, sure, like get them to talk. If you're talking to like a bug scientist and for some reason they just don't want to tell you something, like it doesn't always feel as urgent to kind of like make them. Did last year I wrote, this is kind of like a good example of finding a weird angle on a newsy thing. I did a story about fruit flies, and like there's this lab in Indiana that raises and ships fruit flies to like many of the labs that need fruit flies, which is a lot because they're really important in like neurology research and other areas, genetics research and stuff. And so I got a news tip that they were continuing through the pandemic shutdowns through like huge amounts of creativity and, you know, grit and coming into work and keeping these flies alive because somebody needs to feed them and clean their little tubes every couple weeks. And these genetic lineages would just die out and we would lose like all these decades of research if the flies died. So I talked to a bunch of people there, and a lot of them were really happy to talk to me, and I had a great time talking with them, and they kind of understood that their jobs were a little bit funny. Like a lot of them were moms doing part-time jobs as like retirement jobs, and they're like, yeah, I work with flies, like my friends think it's funny, but like I really love it, and here's why. It was kind of easy to get them to see like, oh, this is your job, it's familiar to you, but like other people aren't gonna know about it, so like what should they know? And then I learned that there was a guy who made the fruit fly food, which is like, there's a very specific recipe for it, and if you get it wrong, the flies are very picky and they will suffer. So he like mixes huge batches of food every day, and he also was coming in during the pandemic, and I was like, oh, I gotta, what'd you say?
What's in the food?
Corn syrup, yeast, other stuff that to you and me would probably not seem.
Just a very like precise potion of whatever they like.
They love it.
Okay, continue.
Yeah, but I was like, I gotta talk to this guy, you know, like he's gonna be like, oh yeah, I'm the fruit fly cook, haha, and he was like, not like that. He was like, this is my job, like, I don't know why it's interesting to other people. And so I did my interview with him, and I was like kind of writing it up in a lighthearted way, and I called him a fruit fly chef. And I called him up to do fact checking, and he was like, don't call me a chef, I'm not a chef, I don't have any training.
No!
I just mix this stuff together. And I was like, oh, that was such a funny line, you know? But then in the end, I was like, it's so much more important to let this guy talk about his job in the way that he wants to and the way that he experiences it. And it was like fine to change the word. But yeah, you sometimes do run into people who like, for whatever reason, aren't gonna play along. But you can still tell people about what they do, or you can see how they think about what they do and try to get that across. And maybe you couldn't pin an entire story on somebody like that, but yeah, it's just like when you encounter it, there are different ways to deal with it.
Yeah, it makes sense. Usually, if you just start digging into details of anything, you don't have to dig for very long to find some detail that strikes you as being pretty surprising. And often it's something that's so ordinary to them that nobody has ever even mentioned it to them. Yeah. And sometimes that thing that nobody's mentioned to them is something they spent a long time figuring out. And you know, everybody's got stuff like that you never mention to anybody because it seems, you know, it's not important and whatever. But it was important to you, and you spent a lot of time, and you're never going to get a chance to tell anybody. And now somebody asks you. Looking at the details is the only, even at random. Often if you look in the footnotes of something, and if you're stuck in a room with a scientist who's showing PowerPoint stuff that has too much information, often the way too much part of the too much is they'll put little tiny type at the bottom. And if you get in the habit of just look at little bits of that, often there's something in there that makes no sense whatsoever. And if you ask them, especially in a setting like this, here I speak from experience because I like to do this, that sometimes they will tell you the whole story on that, which is far more interesting to everybody in the room than anything they were talking about. But it wasn't anything that they had normally planned to talk about because it seemed like nobody's going to care. You never know. I want to mention something else about how easy it is for something to appear either interesting or not. There was a workshop I did a couple years ago at University of Manchester in England. I don't know why I got asked to do this, but they asked me to do a workshop to get some, I think it was postdocs in medicine, interested in what they were doing or thinking or something. So, and also get them better about talking to reporters and other people. So came up with what felt like it might be worth trying, and we did it. So I just posed them as a little challenge that for anybody who wanted, each of you is working on a thesis or paper or something, and none of you knows the other's work in much detail. Could you come up here and just in 30 seconds tell the story plainly of what you're working on? This at the moment is your life's work, and do it two ways. First spend 30 seconds describing it in the most dull way you can do it, so nobody in the world would want to hear the 31st second. And then describe it in a way that if somebody with grant money is here, that you want to get their attention so much that they're going to come up to you and just throw money at you after 30 seconds. You should be able to describe that. Shouldn't be a big deal. Nobody could do it. What each of them did, the ones that dared to do it, was they told the same story twice in exactly the same words and the same tone of voice.
Oh, no.
Until we pointed it out to them. And the first person who did that, the first student, was kind of brave and let me push at it. And so did play with it and ended up pretty quickly getting the hang of it. And after one did, then the next one did, and then they all kind of did. But they had all been so used to describing what they were doing in one way that they didn't even realize this is just rote, that is meaningless to everybody, and you're not attracting anybody, you're not repelling anybody, it's just oatmeal you're giving. And when you're talking to somebody or reading something, you might want to remind yourself of that. They're used to describing their story in a way that's probably nowhere near as interesting as the way, somebody with a little experience is going to be able to describe it.
For sure. Dan?
Oh, I just, on the topic of trying to get people to tell you, the fun stuff that they really don't want to tell you or they feel uncomfortable, they're like, is this journalist going to make fun of me? Are they going to minimize my work? I had two things that I do, and I thought I might get you guys to react to it. One of them very sort of noble and straightforward, and the other one devious. And the straightforward one is just appeal to their desire to actually get people interested in science, especially young people. And I have sort of examples that I always point to when somebody says, why are you asking me about something so trivial? And then I will explain, things from my experience in which this was a window to draw people in, and that usually works. The second devious one is the really fun, trivial stuff that they would consider trivial, but that you would consider essential to reaching a large audience and reaching people who aren't normally interested in these kinds of stories. I bury those questions, and I embed those questions within a very long string of serious questions, and then I'll just sort of pop those in, and they're much less likely to, make an issue out of it. And
This is your version of devious?
yeah, it is devious because it's a little bit misleading,
Yeah, I suppose.
And then afterwards they'll say, "How did you? I don't even remember you asking me about that." And you're like, "Oh yeah, I asked you about it." And in the end, if you do it well, they're not angry because they realize, wow, this was a way to bring this work that only 12 people care about. It was a way to bring this work to thousands and thousands, and that kind of works. Cara, do you ever try that? Are you not as devious as me in that way?
I don't know. I wouldn't call myself devious. I think for me, I think by the time I'm talking to someone, often they have read one of my articles or they sort of know what the section of the paper I'm writing for is like or whatever, and they're kind of prepared. I haven't yet come into a situation where somebody doesn't really know what they're in for or isn't willing to share that kind of stuff. I'm sure I will, and then maybe I'll become devious, but I've been lucky so far.
Yeah, that would be my experience too, is I mostly just try to because I think enthusiasm can be, in my experience, pretty contagious. So, if I just go into a call just so jazzed about their work, and even sometimes I'll again, I'm not a writer really much anymore, but if you pick something out of the paper, like a method, like something from the methods that's just like way in there, and be like, so what was that like? Like, tell me all about the work. And then, you can ask like the more fun stuff. But I just think enthusiasm is really contagious.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one trick I have, if it's a trick, is figuring out who to talk to, like especially on a paper. If it has a lot of authors, it can be hard to figure out like who actually did the work. So figuring, maybe like, you write to the corresponding author and they are like, yes, I want to talk to you. I want to be in the New York Times. And so you talk to them, and then like every single question, they're like, oh, actually my PhD student did that. Just like be like, okay, cool, thanks. Please connect me with your PhD student. And then you can talk to the person who actually did it, and they have a lot more sort of like nitty-gritty fun details for you. And then you have to put everyone in the article or they get mad at you. But that's a separate issue.
Cool.
I also like sometimes faux naivete goes a long way depending on who you're talking to. So that's like probably the most devious thing I do is pretend that I don't already know what they're gonna say, or like I'm like, oh, explain that to me, and then they do, or like I don't quite get that. Then they explain it again in a way that's like more fun. That's my biggest trick,
Real
I guess.
naivete can be pretty powerful too.
Yeah, that's true. Sometimes
Yeah.
you really don't know.
And sometimes you're dealing with somebody, I don't think we got into it all, the question of when you're dealing with something where there's either some apparent dishonesty or a lot less than they're making out. And this is another thing that applies not just to science, but to anything covered in the news, in any news anywhere, is you make a decision whether you think about it or not, about how much you're going to simply present clearly what they're telling you, and how much you're going to try to figure out where this sits on some spectrum of, is it real and is it true? And can we talk for a moment about sort of the sciences in general? There's, I think you've all heard lots of discussions about how there's this tradition that the math and physics are the hardest and in some sense, in that sense, most important of the sciences, and then you get down to chemistry.
An interesting perspective.
And then, well, you've heard these discussions many times, I'm sure.
Sure, coming from some people.
And then biology and medicine, and then down into the behavioral sciences and all that. And there's certainly a lot of truth in that, but I think it's also completely opposite to the truth, in that the reason there's so much prestige in those things at the top of that list is those are the things where you can agree what you're talking about, where you can agree what you're measuring. You throw two rocks at each other, you can measure how much they weigh, how far they bounce. You talk about how people react to each other, what are you even talking about? People, and even professional people all in the same field in psychology say, they all use exactly the same words, which they will tell you have exact, precise meanings to them. That's never true. And you can have a lot of fun, and your readers can have a lot of fun if you try to not use their official jargon or lingo. I've been told not to use jargon, it's insulting. But just translate it into plain words. And really press them about, have a plain English language discussion about what they're saying they found here and how do they know it's true. And I want to mention something else that's related to this too. This was a discussion between two people who had won Ig Nobel Prizes. We have a lot of events around the world, and so I travel with a lot of them, and we have a lot of time to just talk. And there was a discussion, and very friendly, between one of them who was a physics professor and one who was, I think, a psychology professor. And the physics professor was saying, and this was entirely out of curiosity. This was nobody in any sense attacking or anything like that. It was just the physics professor was saying, I've wondered about this for a long time. In my field, when there's a new paper that comes out in my specialty, we all assume there's something wrong in this paper, and we all work really hard to find it. Now, sometimes it's all right, but that's rare. So our automatic response, in fact, that's most of what our job is. We look for what's wrong in every paper, and we know that when we publish a paper, everybody else is, and that's why we all get ahead. But I don't understand your field because I just am not close to it, and it looks to me like that's not the way things are done there. It almost looks like people assume that when a new paper comes out in your field, or whatever field in psychology, the assumption is this is correct, and now everybody knows this is correct, and we'll build some new experiments on that. And the psychology professor said, yeah, that's pretty much the way it is, because that's our tradition, that when a paper is published, we all work hard, and we, to a large degree, trust each other. So our tradition is when a paper comes out, that's now established as a fact in science. This is in the field where it's most difficult to even agree what you're talking about, let alone what is the truth of it. Whereas in the field where it's easiest to measure things.
It's interesting, too, because I feel like a lot of the math and physics world is gate-kept from a lot of different kinds of people as well, and it seems like even within their own established communities, they try to gatekeep each other. It's like, I don't know. Whereas some other parts of the science world are more inclusive of all kinds of people, and they're less gatekeepy. I don't know. Maybe it's just part of that culture. Maybe there's more to it than that.
There's a lot of He-Man stuff in the...
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
A lot of egos, perhaps.
But the other side of that, which turns it around, is a lot of the people in the physics math world, as you've seen, don't have an enormous amount of respect for the people who are looking at how people behave and how they think, because they think this is fuzzy stuff, it's difficult to measure. Well, they're right, it's difficult to measure. It's tough. And when anybody is able to get any insight there, they've done tremendously difficult stuff.
Right, it's admirable.
But it's not measurable in the same way. And so you get these weird
and I'd also argue
people looking down at each other for sometimes very strange reasons.
Totally. And just because you can measure it more discreetly doesn't make it more or less important either. You know what I mean? Like, measurability does not equate. It's how important, or how much it moves the field forward, or new insights, that sort of thing.
And a scientist who was a very close friend and was a great scientist who died a number of years ago, and also had a good sense of humor, used to like to say, in the science world, if you can measure it, it must be important. So, think about that.
Interesting. Well, we have a question. Hello.
That's actually a great intro to my question. Hi, I'm Casey. I'm really interested in sort of what you all think about applications, like when you're writing or when you're, awarding these prizes. You talked earlier about how we might not know how it might be important, how quickly these bugs regurgitate. Like, is that something that you think about a lot? I guess both of y'all, when you're writing one of these like weird science pieces, are you really looking for that? Like, do you think that's important to convince people that these sorts of stories are important? Like, this might open up these doors, like penicillin was discovered on accident, like all those sorts of like weird things. And then I guess also for the prizes, how important is that? Like, no, I promise this might be important for like our narrow understanding of the world that will affect your life.
Yeah, so I think, just as an aside, the bee regurgitation thing, the reason that's important is that as we are, genetically modifying crops to have better yield or be more climate resilient, we need to make sure that the bees that pollinate them are able to quickly regurgitate the nectar and pollen so that they don't get too exhausted to continue to pollinate. It's like the viscosity of it is actually super vital for their quality of life. If it's too thick, it takes them too long to get it, hork it back up into their little honey pots, then they don't live as long. So, for that one, there is kind of a clear...
horking up into the honey pots got me.
Yeah. There's sort of a clear one-to-one. I think for me, personally, that's not super important. I just really like knowing these little facts about nature and animals. I have a larger project, which is sort of convincing everybody that these animals deserve to share the earth with us. So that kind of motivates me to do these stories. In terms of editors, readers, the scientists themselves, often that is sort of a piece of what they want to know. So I do try to always ask about that and include it when I can. Then there's also sort of the little meta thing where you can be like you said, we might not know why it's important right now, but maybe we will in the future. And I think that can be its own kind of cool philosophical conversation. Why do we want to know anything?
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I have a similar perspective. I just love knowing all the cool stuff, and I think that's enough to report about it. But of course, if anything is going to get funded, they probably need a reason that it's applicable to human beings. So for that reason, I think, if you want to like propel science forward, as a journalist, obviously, I don't know. And editors often will love to have like the human element. It's big audiences care about that. Like, how does that apply to the human race? But I'm with you. Like, some stuff can just be cool.
My editor is always asking me, can people see this bug in their backyard? I'm like, maybe. And he's like, let's throw that in there. There has to be like some like entry point sometimes.
Yeah.
I sometimes get a little sheepish when I'm asking scientists like, but why is what you do important? It's kind of a hard question. I often preface it by being like, I think it's important, but what would you tell someone else?
Totally.
But there's another form of that question, though, which is, why is it important to you? Which is maybe a better... almost the whole history of science, I think, and also the history of everything else, including everybody's personal life, is when somebody first thinks of something or first discovers something, almost nobody else thinks it's important. Almost everybody else's reaction is either, so what, or that's stupid, or why did you do that, or why are you wasting your time, or why should I care? And that applies to almost everything that all of us learned in every science course we took. If you take the time, which you may have done with a few things, to go back and look at the very earliest stages, or if you talk to any scientist, especially somebody who's become kind of famous for something they discovered, and you really, really ask them to talk about the very earliest time they started to play with this, almost always the story is just nobody else cared, and you start hearing a sea of interesting stories sometimes or sometimes not. But the important question, there are also cycles of important. Things get discovered, and sometimes they'll even be reported and celebrated for a few years, and then they disappear. And decades go by, and somebody else discovers the same damn thing. And sometimes that repeats. You may know the name Mandelbrot, Benoit Mandelbrot. He made an entire career out of going and looking at old published stuff that nobody had looked at probably for 50 or 100 or 150 years, and resurrecting it. Some of it was stuff that you really couldn't go very far then, but with a computer, you can do this stuff in a snap that nobody could possibly have done then. But a lot of it isn't technological stuff. It's just it just didn't happen to catch on then. So this important stuff, and sometimes things won't become important until other things are in place. If you really trace back the history of the vaccines that have just come out, some of those would not happen without discoveries made 50 years ago that almost nobody cared about except the people working on them. And luckily somebody did fund them, but they probably had to resort to mild trickery to get the funding there. Hey, I brought a handful of slides I wanted to show you of things that I think are kind of dull on the surface that if you poke just slightly are anything but that won prizes. Do we have time to?
Sure, yeah, we could do slides. We still have just about 25 minutes or so to go, so we could do those slides. The clicker is here if you want to click through them. I do love, the story of the duck penis, so.
Why don't you tell it?
Just that it's a corkscrew, and then the duck vagina is also a corkscrew, but sometimes in the opposite direction, right? Is that the story?
Yeah, and how they interact, though, and how the ducks interact is an extremely complicated and extremely colorful story. But I just wanted to show you for context. I mean, the other thing I do lots of stuff that's related. The prizes, take all year of organizing with a bunch of us. There's a magazine, which is also about stuff that makes people laugh and then think. This comes out every 2 months. And then lots of forms. So every issue is a special issue. This one, all sorts of stuff about ducks. I won't go into that. And one issue every year is about the Ig Nobel winners for that year. I'll talk slightly about this moment. This is 2 Ig Nobel winners at the moment that a Nobel Prize winner is handing them their Ig Nobel Prize. And if you look at the 3 faces, they are all equally shocked and mostly delighted. This won a prize, so you can see the title, is Ha, a Universal Word, Conversational Infrastructure, and the Convergent Evolution of Linguistic Items. Not something that most people would pick up and want to have a discussion with, especially among their friends and all. But what they discovered, and the reason they won a prize, is they looked at people who talk a lot of different languages in a lot of parts of the world. And they discovered that every language that they looked at, every group of people everywhere they looked at, has a word that either is huh or sounds very, very much like it and is used in exactly the same way. And it has lots of uses, but the main use, the most frequent use, and it's really frequent, like every minute of almost every conversation, although people don't realize it, is the instant somebody kind of loses the thread of what the other person is saying, they'll say, huh? Or something just like that. And when they started trying to run some little experiments of having people talk without doing that, nobody could carry on a conversation. This beautiful little word, huh, which seems like nothing. That's one thing. This picture you may have seen long ago, maybe buried deep in your mind.
It seems familiar.
Yeah, it's from the late 1950s. This was a government project. This guy's name is John Stapp. He was in the Army, the U.S. Army at that time. This was at a time when World War II had just ended. They were looking back at all the deaths from airplane crashes and also wondering what was going to happen now that jets were starting to come and the speeds were increasing drastically. So what kind of safety stuff could they and should they build into things? Because there wasn't a whole lot of safety stuff built in. Basically, the assumption up until this time was if your plane crashes, we assume you're all going to die, so there's no point in building a lot of stuff in there. And they ran some tests. You may have seen the films of this, where in the desert in California, they put railroad tracks out in this flat desert, and at the end of it, a pool of water as the brake, and and a rocket on the back of the little sled. So this would accelerate to a very high speed, would hit the water, and it was almost like slamming into a wall. And they had a camera on the guy riding the sled. That's what you're seeing.
This poor
here.
man.
And indirectly from this came most of the safety stuff that's been built into things. And indirectly later, this particular guy, who's the doctor on there, became the main advocate in the world for putting seatbelts into cars. He is the main reason that there are seatbelts in cars. Anyway, the reason we gave this a prize was this also is, as best we or anybody else could determine, this was the project at which the phrase Murphy's Law was coined. And that's
No
what the
way.
prize was for. There's a historian named Nick Spark in California who spent enormous amounts of time trying to track down this question of who came up with this phrase, Murphy's Law. And you know Murphy's Law. It's the idea if anything can possibly go wrong, it will, which is actually an extremely important principle, maybe the most important principle of all engineering or planning. If you don't look at everything that can go wrong when you're designing something, it's going to go wrong and you're going to suffer terribly. So anyway, this was the doctor on it. He ran the sled. He couldn't stand the idea of anybody else making somebody else ride this, so he ran it himself. They learned a lot. He became quite famous. So there was a press conference after several months or years of doing this where John Stapp, the celebrity, was there. Some reporter asked him, look, what you've just done was a series of things intensely dangerous. You could have been killed. You know, why weren't you killed? How is it possible you're still alive? And Stapp smiled and said something like, it's because we paid strict attention to Murphy's Law. And the story behind that was there was a Murphy. When they first ran the test with a dummy rather than a person, just to make sure the equipment worked, every time they'd run it, the sled would work fine, but all the equipment to measure anything they were trying to measure didn't. And all the gauges read 0, as if this thing had never run at all. And nobody involved with the project understood much about electronics. So they heard there's this Captain Murphy out in the Army base in Ohio who knows a lot about electronics. So they flew him out for 2 days. That was his whole involvement. Murphy watched them run one of these tests, went over, looked in and started swearing and said something which nobody wrote down, so nobody knows exactly his words. And there's a big argument to this day about his motivation. But what he said was something like, if there's a wrong way to do it, those guys will do it that way. And ever since then, we gave this prize almost 20 years ago, at which point only one person was alive. Stapp was dead, Murphy was dead, Murphy's son came, and the guy who'd been the army head of this little project was still alive, not in good shape, but alive. So the three of them were given the prize, two posthumously. And two of them believed that Murphy said, two of the three winners believed that Murphy said it as a great principle. But the third guy, who the boss, hated Murphy's guts and was convinced that Murphy said that as a personal insult to one technician. And went to his death, I'm pretty sure he's dead, he spent the last years of his life trying to crusade, trying to convince the world that Murphy gets too much credit for Murphy's Law. And what we learn from this, what I think is one of the great lessons from this whole search for what's the beginning of it, a lot of these people were still alive when the historian was looking, and a lot of stuff was written down. And even with all that, he was not able to track down the answer to this simple question that should have been easy to answer. So any other question that's more complicated, how much should you absolutely trust that we know what the real story is? This is this paper and a similar paper from another team, unrelated, happened to be at the same time, shared an Ig Nobel Prize, again about 20 years ago. The citation was something like for discovering that herrings apparently communicate by farting. Herrings, it's actually noise that comes from the swim bladder, from bubbles coming out through the swim bladder. And they both discovered it. But the best part of the story, we didn't know at the time we gave the prize. It came out years later, because one of the co-authors told me, and it's just barely mentioned, hinted at the end of the paper, one little line that says something like, "We thank the Swedish Navy for providing use of equipment." The story was, the other team, which was Scottish and Canadian, they were studying herring. But the Swedish team that did this paper, two of the big marine biologists in Sweden, they were asked to do it essentially by the Prime Minister of Sweden. The Prime Minister of Sweden at that time had been making many public complaints that, this was at a time when the Soviet Union still existed, that the Soviet Union was sending submarines into Swedish waters to spy on them. And the Prime Minister kept announcing that he had proof of this, and his proof always kept evaporating. It wasn't any proof at all, and he was starting to look pretty foolish. And so what he did to get proof was he ordered the Swedish Navy stick some microphones underwater in the harbor in Stockholm, in the capital, and record the sounds there. And then we're going to have a bunch of scientists from different fields who we choose, the best we've got in different fields, in secret, look at this stuff and bless it for us. And so that's what they did. They came out with a sound that was, very quickly they got it. It was a regular but that was much more rhythmic than I say. It was very, very obviously almost a mechanical kind of sounding thing. And so everybody in the secret groups was very excited, and then they went to get the marine biologists to look at this. And the two marine biologists listened to this tape. And they said, yes, that's a very fine recording you have. That's not a submarine, that's a fish. And give us a little time, we'll tell you exactly what kind. And didn't take them long. They got some herrings and held them underwater in a little tank of water, and they could reproduce that sound exactly. And the Swedish Prime Minister's response to this, all of this being done top secret to this point, was, "You're wrong. It's submarines, and we are going to announce it, and you are sworn to secrecy." And that's the end of the story. And then these two scientists did what I think is a great act of bravery. And you can paint it as a funny story or a serious one. I think it's both. They decided, no, we're going to tell the public what this is. If you get up and say that, go ahead. But then we're going to tell the public what it really is. And the Swedish Prime Minister backed down and never made this.
No
and
way.
it stayed secret for years and years until Magnus Wahlberg told me this story and asked him, "Is this still secret?" And he said, no, enough time's gone by, it's not. Has anybody heard the story? No, it's never been told in public.
Someone should
Wow.
option this
So,
from you.
you know, I had been invited to come and do a Ig Nobel show, bring some Ig Nobel Prize winners to the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, which is the place they decide some of the Nobel Prizes. So we had a show there, and that was the first public announcement, and it got press coverage from around the world, especially in Sweden, and I just think that's a wonderful story. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to ask how many more slides.
We can stop now.
Some great
Yeah.
stories in those slides. Yeah, we can take a question, and then I have a couple questions after these questions, specifically for Cara about book stuff. But we can continue here. Go for it.
So hi, I'm Ish. This is sort of more of a logistical question. You know, sometimes when you're looking at a paper, something like, you know, sounds produced by fish, bubbles, or something like that, you can instantly, oh, what is that? But, you know, I imagine this study on bee vomiting or something was not something like bees are vomiting. I sort of was like, you know, digestive reflexes of something. When you're perusing the scientific literature,
This is going to be my question.
how do
This
you
is
know?
good.
Yeah, how do you know what to stop and really look for?
How do you find the weird stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm working on some bigger projects right now, so this isn't as like big a part of my daily life, but it used to be every single week I have this big spreadsheet of like sort of major and minor scientific journals, and I would just read the table of contents, and anything that kind of caught my eye, I would read the abstract, and then anything that caught my eye from that, I would keep reading. And you know, hundreds of articles come out every single week, maybe even every single day. So it's sort of a numbers game. Like there's going to be something in there that makes you go like, what? I wish I could remember what journal the bee paper came from and what it was called. But I just sort of have like a radar now, and you can kind of like, something pings, and then I'm sure I miss a lot of stuff still, because you're right, there are a lot of obscure terms, but just have to spend some time like trawling, and you can get a sense for it. And I think that's true of any beat, you know, like when you've covered something for long enough, no matter what it is, you start to get a feel for like what's new and exciting and what's old and tired. So
Do you know like what makes up your radar anymore? Because like for me, it's often what could I tell my friends who like don't even remotely work in science or journalism, and like what will make them go, excuse me?
yeah, that's a really good one. I was gonna say before that having this beat is like really good for text threads, because you can just like drop
Yes.
something in there and then disappear for the whole day, and everyone else is like dealing with it. But yeah, I think it's something like that. It's also like if I can picture a headline in my head when I read the study, if I sort of know what the hook is, that can be really helpful for pitching too, because if you're pitching something, the editor's gonna want to know what the headline should be. But yeah, if I can find sort of a way in pretty quickly, that's like helpful.
Cool beans. Okay, another question? Go for it.
Yeah, oh, well, let me say also, people telling you, I'm in a luckier position than most people because I've been doing this a long time, and it's known in a lot of places. So every day I get floods of stuff from people who notice something in their own field or some other place. And most of it's not useful, but when there's a steady flood over time, as exactly the same thing, you just keep pouring day after day through these little seas of things, you're going to notice something. And one little trigger is does something just not quite make sense? And maybe it never will, and maybe it's not worth your time more than another 5 seconds. But if you don't spend the 5 seconds...
Hey, I'm Ilana.
Hi.
So
I know you.
hey. So also about Cara's book. I remember when I was a little kid, my parents had a book called "Why Do Men Have Nipples?" And just how do you know when it's time to write a book about weird science? Who is it for, if not just for you?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think I don't know yet if it's for anyone, because the books are not in the world and maybe no one will buy a single one. But in terms of what the publishers are maybe banking on, I think that, let me think about how to phrase this, I guess. There definitely is a difference between, like, I'm skimming the New York Times and I don't really want to read about COVID, so like, here's a really great platypus article and that's what I'm gonna click on. And like, I'm going into a bookstore and buying a book about platypuses, for sure. And I think that's something that I'm actually trying to figure out right now, is like what makes something worthy of a larger story or that sort of treatment. In terms of what I'm actually working on, both of my books are sort of like compendiums, like thematic compendiums. So the one for middle schoolers is about animals that have senses that people don't have that allow them to do jobs for people. So there's like dogs that sniff out the poop of endangered whales so that scientists can study them. There's like pigeons that deliver packages because they have like a special magnetic homing sense. There's like 8 different examples of that. And so it was sort of just like writing, I wrote it with a co-author, but each of us basically wrote 4 news articles about those topics and then added like little side boxes and stuff about related themes. And so it was pretty cohesive. And I think that's like one way to approach it is if you like find enough stories that fit under the same umbrella, then they can be a book. And the book for Atlas Obscura is, I don't know if you're like familiar with their other books, but they're also like very big compendiums of sort of strange and unexpected things. The one I'm writing is specifically about animals, plants, fungi, stuff like that. And so the challenge with that is honestly like, again, the weird animal stories really stick out of a newspaper, especially one like the New York Times, because they're so different from everything else. When you have thing after thing that's the same, how do you make it compelling for that many pages? And luckily, the natural world is truly inventive, and there are a lot of different cool things about a lot of different species, so it's not that hard. But it's definitely a different challenge, and I've been really like surprised but excited about how hard it is to kind of take that next step. Yeah.
That was going to be my question for you after we got through. Oh, we have another question. Cool. Okay. But that was just going to be my my other thought was that, like, you know, we've talked about like enthusiasm in a web story, let's say, but then how do you like keep that going for a whole book? Like, it seems like it's a challenge.
Yeah, it totally is. And I think that as I like move forward and do more stuff, I'm looking more and more for stories that maybe have more people in them, because characters that are human, as much as I love animals, you can't interview them. There's only so much you can really get out of them. If you have human characters, that can kind of help carry you along. And in a lot of my longer pieces, I find myself focusing more on people.
Cool.
And on the animal stories, the people who looked at these things, who discovered this stuff, they all have lots of stories in them if you poke at them about what struck them as mysterious or crazy or whatever. So even something that appears at first glance to have no connection with people, it always has connections with people. And once you start getting them interested, life gets pretty good.
Cool. Another question? Go for it.
Hi, I'm Wanjia. So I know finding a good story is only the first step of getting a really good story article. The other part is writing it. So like, is there any like technique or any tips you want to share that you can strike this balance between being accurate and also give reader the nuances in the scientific paper, but also not inundate your writing with those dull languages so that you kind of lose the spirit of quirkiness and wittiness?
This is a great question. This was also in my list of backup notes, so thank you for asking it. Hi.
Yeah, I wonder, I'm actually kind of interested in how you tackled this, Jess, because I know you do like audio, and so the idea of doing it like more conversationally, I feel like it's different, but like, yeah, I would love to hear what you have to say if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Like, in terms of like keeping the science there while keeping it really conversational and fun, I think if anything, like, it's the job of the producer to do that, because really the thing I'm most concerned with in the shows, Ask Us Anything is like very scripted, so that's very easy. You can just like script in the hard science. But our other show, Weirdest Thing, is like runs like over an hour, very conversational, and I think like I think the harder part is getting it to be conversational and fun. Like, the science is always going to be there, and oftentimes if they get carried away and having conversations, and I can just be like chime in with like a question, like, oh, so what happened with this particular measurement or whatever, as the producer, and then cut myself out, you know, and like sneakily get them to put in the science, like that is like how I would handle it. I think the biggest challenge is just getting them to be enthusiastic. And really, for Weirdest Thing, it's not a challenge because everybody is really jazzed about finding something weird. But I think audio in general, that is the hardest thing, because not everybody sounds good on tape, which is hard. But yeah, and again, I think it's that contagious enthusiasm that really goes a long way in audio too.
Yeah, well, we've got a podcast that started for CBS a long time ago, and then CBS actually disappeared. CBS radio network killed itself off, but I own the podcast, so we've continued since then. So, and it's always conversations with people, and I do what you described, but maybe many times multiplied, which is I interrupt a lot, not for the sake of interrupting. It's just if I feel either I don't quite understand or I think somebody else won't care because they don't have the background or something, I'll just try to ask the simplest question I can think of, which often is just why does da-da-da, or how does that work? But even stop them in the middle of a sentence if they seem to be going off someplace that's not good. People usually don't mind that if you're asking a good question. But you can practice that, and I think you can, almost anybody can get better at that really quickly. It's just not our habit. And often scientists really appreciate doing that, because often the questions, if you start asking them, start getting into not just aiming at them, but at why do other people do things, or why does this field, or does this whole field make sense? You know, are those insects, whatever? And just a very few questions, but frequently to keep the thing alive, can keep it surprisingly alive. There are a few people who are just really bad at it, and it's, and you know, if you're really stuck with one of them, you're really stuck. But if you can, if you have the choice of who you're going to be interviewing, if it's an audio thing or a video thing, if you could weed out the ones who just, you know, sadly are utterly incapable.
I mean, it's why places like NPR do, like, or anywhere big really does like pre-interviews. You know what I mean? You try to find your good source who's going to sound good, because you only have so much time.
Have you ever had somebody who was so bad that you were happy they were on?
Like, because it was funny how bad they were?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. Not that I can think of. I mean, everybody I work with on staff is like brilliant, so I don't really run into that issue. But sorry, Cara, do you have something else to add?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, like, for writing, since I think that's what your question was about, like from a craft perspective, I I was like stalled for a long time so I could actually think of something to say, so thank you.
Got you.
No, but I also really wanted to hear what you both had to say. I often write pretty short. Like, a lot of my articles are less than 800 words. And in an article like that, you really want every sentence to be doing something, but every sentence doesn't have to be doing the same thing. So if you can kind of alternate between, like, this sentence is funny, this sentence is kind of like poetic or sort of gets across a nice image, this sentence propels the story and gives you information. And if you can kind of like alternate those or disperse them so that, like, as the reader is reading, they don't get tired of any one thing and they are pulled through the story to the end. I think that's the thing that I strive for when I'm writing. And sort of, you can do it with quotes, you can do it with imagery, you can do it with explanations. But yeah, I think that's how I approach it. And as stories get longer, you do that, but everything gets stretched out. So maybe you get 2 or 3 sentences for each thing.
That's really great advice, because I remember when I would write, and it's just like, I was constantly thinking about, like, it's the internet. Like, how long can I keep their attention? Or I guess it's also the paper, you know. But still, you know.
Yeah. No, when
There's
I was
one great set of written guidelines that maybe you know, and I'm pretty sure Dan knows, by a guy named Tim Radford, who was the science editor for the Guardian newspaper in London for a long time, who was just a terrific writer in plain language that gets deep into things immediately and is mesmerizing. Somebody asked him to write a little list, I think it's called something like 25 Rules for the Modern Scribbler or something like that. And it's one of the few really useful short things. You might Google that, Tim Radford and 25, we'll probably get to it.
Mm.
So, go ahead.
I just have one more
go ahead.
question that I wanted to bring up, but is this related? Because mine's not related.
It is
cool,
related.
You go then.
I was just going to say that, Cara, one of the things I think you do really, really well, among other things, is figuring out the metaphors and similes that are really clever, but not trite. You know, like, and so, like, what's your process for analogy? Because I think you're quite good at it.
Yeah, I think my whole life I have been really into sort of like just the way my brain works, very, very like animism oriented, where like when I see something, I just consider it to be extremely alive. And I think that helps me because I can compare objects and animals and people and the things that all of those things do pretty easily in my head. Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like I'd have to think about it for a lot longer. Sometimes I also ask my friends for help, to be honest. Maybe it's cheating. I had to write a story about blue whales and their hearts once, and I was trying to come up with a comparison for how big a blue whale heart is, and I asked my sister, and she immediately was like, a dunk tank. And I was like, that's amazing.
That rules.
Yeah, so sometimes I farm it out. But yeah, I think those are often the things that I take the longest on in an article, especially if there's only room for one or two, because I do want them to be like very evocative and sort of concrete. But yeah, I just think about like, if this thing wasn't an animal, what would it remind me of? Or if this thing was not a plant, or if it was a person, like what it's doing remind me of?
Just to add one quick thing, another thing that one of the reasons that I think your use of metaphor is so good is that you never overdo it. Like as you said, I read a few pieces and I saw like no more than like 2, but and if there were more, then the impact would be diminished. So that's a really great lesson for you guys. Go for the metaphor, but don't overdo it. Which is funny because I was working with one student who's here and suggesting just piling on the puns one after another after another. That was an exception. But usually you want to be super selective about it, and I think you're really good at that.
Thank you. Yeah, you could ask whether that's a hereditary trait that person is showing you.
The puns.
That kind of deep love of excessive puns.
So we don't have that much time left, but the last thing that I wanted to ask about is something that we think about on Weirdest Thing a lot, which is like considering what is actually weird or worth pitching without being too othering. And we think, or at least, yeah, I would say we, in general, like when we work on the podcast, are very careful about like xenophobia. Is that something you guys like come across when you're thinking about like pitching something and like, look how weird this is, but like, yeah, I guess that's my question.
Absolutely, I think about that all the time. I think with animal and plant stories, it can be a little bit easier because if you're calling something from another we haven't gotten to a point yet where people like react badly to that, which maybe we will at some point. I don't really know. But something that I come across a lot actually is situations where someone has discovered something that other people actually already knew for a long time.
Yeah.
So like it's new to science, but it's not new to the people who live in this place and work with these animals every day or see them every day. So I really try to avoid covering things as new when they're not new. And something I've been trying to do more and more is talk to people who aren't even necessarily scientists but have knowledge about these places and these animals and these plants. And that's been extremely rewarding. And even it doesn't make it any less fun. You know, it actually makes it much richer and deeper and more interesting because a lot of these people have amazing things to say and amazing experiences. So that's one way that I kind of approach it from within my beat. But yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Like maybe it's new to science, so like it's a flag for us to like check it out. But then, but then you know, go deeper. Like see
that becomes a mania. There's I won't mention the magazines. There's Science Magazine that had somebody as an editor for a while that I ended up not writing anything for it because I run across a lot of stories that are new to anybody who would read them. Almost nobody knows, even in these fields. But there's no press release that came out recently, and there's no paper. There are papers and things, but they might have been published 10 years ago or 50 years ago. And they're great stories, and you do read this kind of story occasionally in places, but this one editor had a mania, as some editors have other manias, that it had to be something that there is a paper published within the last 6 months, maybe a year, or else it's not news. And it could be the best story in the world that everybody missed, but if it wasn't something that was published in a paper in the last few years, that person is no longer the editor, and I think that may be not pure accident.
I interned there for quite some time.
We'll
but
talk
you know,
after
it depends.
because I wonder if it's the same there that we're talking about.
I mean, and it depends on the outlet too. Yeah. You know, I don't know. I think everybody has a different perspective. I think that's like, you know, weird science in general. Like all we've been talking about tonight, like perspective is like really like what it comes down to.
There's also double perspective. If you're writing about science regularly in some place, you've got probably your editor that you're dealing with, and then the higher up editor for especially if it's a
Sure.
general news organization. And almost as a rule, the general editors for things don't have much background appreciation or tolerance even of something to do with science. And so your editor will have the difficulty of selling the idea that this is worth space. And so you're put in the position of having to do that sort of double level of selling to your editor.
Yeah, and I think that also varies from publication to publication.
Oh, yeah.
But
Oh, yeah.
It's definitely a real. I don't know if I would call it an issue, but it's a situation that many deal with.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. Just going back to like perspective. I mean, from like sifting through the journals and like the spreadsheet. I love the spreadsheet. Like deciding for yourself with your own radar what is weird, and then how do you frame it as weird to another person, an editor, to make their perspective like agree with yours. I don't know. It's just like such a great way to communicate science. But yeah, I mean, we're at time, right? Are we at 8? Do we have to be out? Should I close things up here?
Yeah, I guess we really do. Well, we have 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts or questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to mention one, which it was something that puzzled me for a long time until another science writer clarified it. And this happened at a meeting of science journalists somewhere in another country. We're both on a panel, and somebody asked her, this was Jennifer Willett, who some of you know, somebody asked her, you write for a lot of publications in a lot of countries. Is there anything different about writing for American audiences as compared with others? And she thought about it for a minute, and she said, yes. In America, science has always been treated as something that's very earnest. And that makes a big difference in the way that you have to write it to get your editor to accept it. And that's not a small thing. You might think about the implications of that.
I just want to say, I think it's really cool that all of you want to do this. And if anyone has any questions for me later, I'll hang out outside or wherever we're allowed to hang out, and you can just come ask me. I'd be happy to keep talking.
Me too.
Yeah, and
Ditto.
thank you all for asking us here.
Thank you, guys. This was really fantastic. Very grateful to Cara and to Marc and the amazing Jess. Thank you so much. And for those of you watching, thank you for watching. This will be archived at journalism.nyu.edu/KC for Kavli Conversation. Thank you to the Kavli Foundation for supporting this for us. Thank you to my students for showing up. And we hope to do more of these from Caveat, ideally with more than just my wonderful students in the audience, and ideally with the bar open, which NYU wouldn't let us do this time. So thank you guys very much.